Yashanke Shirada nahi veda yatha pashu. Yasyam keshira adaya loka sapiti nirvita swayam dharmam adharmam va nahi veda yatha pashu. Yasyam keshira adaya loka sapiti nirvita swayam dharmam adharmam va nahi veda yatha pashu.
Yasyam keshira adaya loka swapiti nirvritaha swayam dharmam adharmam va nahi veda yatha pashu.
Yasyam keshira adaya loka swapiti nirvita swayam dharmam adharmam va nahi veda yatha pashu.
Yasyam keshira adaya loka swapiti nirvrita swayam dharmam adharmam va nahi veda yatha pashu.
Yasyam keshira adaya
loka swapiti nirvita swayam dharmam adharmam va nahi veda yatha pashu.
So I'll read the sixth verse. Sagatam napitatmanam krita maitram acetanam visrambaniya bhutanam sakrino dogdum arhati. Yasya of who? Anke on the lap. Shira the head. Adhaya placing. Lokaha the general mass of people. Swapiti sleep. Nivrita in peace. Swayam personally. Dharmam religious principles or the goal of life. Adharmam irreligious principles. Va or na not he indeed Veda no Yatha exactly like Ashuhu an animal Saha such a person Katam how Nyarpita Atmanam unto the living entity who has fully surrendered Krita Maitram endowed with good faith and friendship Acetanam with undeveloped consciousness foolish Vishrambhanya deserving to be the object of faith Bhutanam of the living entities Sagrina who has a soft heart
who has a soft heart,
for the good of all people,
for the good of all people,
to give pain,
to give pain,
Arhati
Arhati
is able.
is able.
Translation and purport by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. People in general are not very advanced in knowledge by which to discriminate between religion and irreligion. The innocent, unenlightened citizen is like an ignorant animal sleeping in peace with its head on the lap of its master, faithfully believing in the master's protection. If a leader is actually kind-hearted and deserves to be the object of a living entity's faith, how can he punish or kill a foolish person who has fully surrendered in good faith and friendship? Purport. The Sanskrit word Vishvasta Katha refers to one who breaks faith or causes a breach of trust. The mass of people should always feel security because of the government's protection. Therefore, how regrettable it is for the government itself to cause a breach of trust and put the citizens in difficulty for political reasons. We actually saw during the partition days in India that although Hindus and Muslims were living together peacefully, manipulation by politicians suddenly aroused feelings of hatred between them, and thus the Hindus and Muslims killed one another over politics. This is a sign of Kali Yuga. In this age, animals are kept nicely sheltered, completely confident that their masters will protect them. But unfortunately, as soon as the animals are fed, they are immediately sent for slaughter. Such cruelty is condemned by Vaishnavas like the Vishnudutas. Indeed, the hellish conditions already described await the sinful men responsible for such suffering. One who betrays the confidence of a living entity who takes shelter of him in good faith, whether that living entity be a human being or an animal, is extremely sinful. Because such betrayals now go unpunished by the government, all of human society is terribly contaminated. The people of this age are therefore described as Manda Sumanda Matayo Manda Bhakya Hyupakutaha. As a consequence of such sinfulness, men are condemned, their intelligence is unclear, they are unfortunate, and therefore they are always disturbed by many problems. Upadutaha. This is their situation in this life, and after death they are punished in hellish conditions. So in Prabhupada he says in the purport that one who betrays the confidence of a living entity who takes shelter of him in good faith, whether that living entity be a human being or an animal, is extremely sinful. So this is interesting because in the Bhagavatam we hear incidents of how the king was approached for shelter by different types of animals. And we may take the first example, which is there. This is of Maharaj Shivi. As we know, Maharaj Shivi, he was approached by a dove or a pigeon who was chased by a hawk. And the pigeon was afraid for its life because the hawk wanted to have the pigeon for its dinner. So it flew and took shelter of Maharaj Shivi. But it so happened that after having arrived at the king's lap for shelter, the hawk, it came and it looked and it said to the king, "Well, you're the king and you're supposed to give everybody protection. You have saved the pigeon, but the pigeon was my rightful source of food. So now I will starve. So what about my protection? I'm also Praja. I've also taken birth in your kingdom. So what about my protection? I will starve." So Maharaj Shivi, he contemplated the situation, and then he proposed to the hawk that I'm obliged to give the pigeon protection, but I will, in exchange for the pigeon's life, I will sacrifice my own flesh. So he made a deal with the hawk that the equivalent weight of flesh, which was on the pigeon's body, would be offered from the king's own flesh. So they made the arrangement to bring a scale, to put the pigeon on one end of the scale, and then Maharaj Shivi would offer the equivalent weight of flesh from his own body on the opposite side of the scale. So he proceeded to cut flesh from his body and put on the scale, but what he thought was sufficient in the first, you can say, attempt was actually not sufficient. The scale would not tip and the pigeon remained seated on the scale, on the floor, you can say. The scale didn't move. So he proceeded to cut further flesh from his body. But he said he understood that that also was insufficient. So when he thus had proceeded to cut as much as he thought was possible and still to keep his life, when he understood he couldn't cut anything more, then he would certainly die. So then he decided that he would put himself totally on the scale. So he threw himself on the scale. And at that time, the pigeon and hawk revealed their identities. They were actually demigods who had come to test the character of Maharaj Shivi. So as we know, there's a stone called, what's the name of that stone? But there's a gold testing stone by which you can test the quality of gold. So the demigods, they came to test the character of Maharaj Shivi, and because he passed in such an exemplary way, then he is celebrated as the most famous person, within history for this completely unselfish act. So that's one incident of a king being approached by shelter by an animal and how he passes wonderfully. There's also another instance in the Bhagavatam, which doesn't exactly have such a happy ending, in one way one may say, and that is that of, with a very instructive lessons for us in our Krishna consciousness, and that is the incident with Maharaj Bharat, who happened to see the distress of a young deer, a little baby deer. And actually one may say that the deer itself didn't approach him directly for shelter in that one sense, but he saw the deer and he was soft-hearted, and he saw that the baby deer in the river would certainly lose its life because it happened to be delivered by the mother in the middle of the river, and with no experience at all, it would certainly drown. So he saw the distress of the baby deer, and because he was soft-hearted, he felt he had to save it from death. So he saved the deer, the baby deer, from the death of drowning. So when the baby deer was there, he had rescued it and put it on land, then he could understand now that this deer absolutely has no shelter but myself. If I leave it in this condition, suddenly some animal will come and eat it up, and thus it will lose its life. So he took it upon himself. Well, I have to give this deer my shelter. And as we know, that had a very unfavorable effect on his own personal sadhana. That because of taking care of the deer, Maharaj Bharat, who was at the end, was in the later part of his life, he had renounced his kingdom, and he was supposed now to fully dedicate himself to his spiritual practice. He took on the business and activity of giving protection to this deer, and because of that, he happened to neglect his spiritual practice, which was essential for him in order to make advancement. So one may argue that the king may have, chosen a bit different behavior to save his spiritual practice from being compromised like that. But unfortunately, in the case of Maharaj Bharat, his spiritual practice was compromised, and the result of that was that he became very attached to the deer and had to take his next birth in the body of a deer. So there's two incidences which we can remember in the Shastra of animals being protected even by king. And there's probably more incidents, but those are the two immediately I can remember. And of course, the lesson for us in the story about Maharaj Bharat is that our spiritual practice, our sadhana, is extremely essential for us. And we need to take care, actually, that our spiritual practices are not compromised. It's very easy, in the name of mercy, to compromise one's spiritual practice, and then actually to find one's spiritual batteries being drained. You check your batteries, your spiritual batteries, and you find my battery is actually in a low point here. There's no juice left. I'm feeling completely drained and exhausted. And it might be just that we have put out too much. We have given out too much of ourselves in the name of mercy, being merciful, but forgot that actually we need ourselves to be recharged. We need some time just to spend in the lap of Krishna, in the sheltering lap of Krishna, just chanting our rounds, chanting our 16 rounds attentively and peacefully, and then being recharged by Krishna. But we may have had the idea that we have to do so much for these people that we neglected that, our sadhana of chanting, and then at one stage feel that, well, I don't feel like I have so much to give anymore, like the batteries seem to be flat. So, from this instance, we take the lesson that we need to check our status. We need to keep measuring always, what's the condition of our spiritual battery. So how, what's our own condition? Because as healthy as we are in spiritual life, as, well situated we are in spiritual life, only to that degree we'll be able to put out, mercy, so to say, or inspiration to others. So we want to keep a good strength always in our batteries, and we want to discharge the surplus. Whatever is there, surplus energy, we want to engage that, to put that forth to the public in general. And it's quite interesting, maybe one thing that could be mentioned here, that we may say that each one of us, we may not have so much output, like our battery may be very small, but there's actually a system within batteries. There's actually a knowledge within batteries. When you combine batteries, you can say the rickshaw drivers, they do this in Copenhagen. they take a battery and they put it next to another battery, and then they connect it to the other battery, and then instead of having 12 volts, you have 24 volts, and then you can connect another battery, and then you have 36 volts, so the power is increased and the output is increased. So we may think of that. This is one way how we can also increase our output, that if we combine our own small battery strength, in preaching, then the output will be greater. So that together alone we may not be so strong, may not be able to do much at all, but if we combine the battery strength, then the output will have to seemingly have a greater effect. So that was a little bit about animals taking shelter. There's another interesting point also, or you can say it's a very vivid in the description by Srila Prabhupada, that because such betrayals now go unpunished by the government, we just heard before that a person who is approached for shelter but doesn't give it is extremely sinful. So Prabhupada continues that because such betrayals now go unpunished by the government, all of human society is terribly contaminated. And as we know, slaughter of animals is perfectly legalized in Denmark. Of course, there's some regulation. Not everybody can open a slaughterhouse. There's some rules and regulations. But still, the act of killing is not discouraged in any way as such. So, Prabhupada says that because this is going on, then all of human society is terribly contaminated. So this is a quite strong word, terribly contaminated. Well, actually that's the situation, and when one happens to get a little clue of Krishna consciousness, a little knowledge of how sinful it is to harm another living entity in that way, then one feels disgusted actually with the status quo, with the activities of the slaughterhouses. So further, Prabhupada cites this verse that the people of this age are therefore described as Manda Sumanda Matayo Manda Bhagya Shupadrutaha. So this is a verse in the first canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam, chapter 1, as in verse 10, and it goes Prayana Payasasabhya Kalau Asmin Yoge Janaha Manda Sumanda Matayo Manda Bhakya Kyupadrutaha. And the translation is O learned one. This is the sages of Naimisharanya. They are addressing Sutta Goswami. And they say, O learned one, in this age of Kali, men have got short lives. They are quarrelsome, lazy, misguided, unlucky, and above all, always disturbed. So this is the sages of Naimisharanya. They're describing how poor the situation is, or how bad the situation, the ill-fated status of the situation, you can say. So Prabhupada, he goes to the second or third line, says Manda Sumanda Matayo. And this laziness, this Manda,